Hello, everyone who's joining us. I think some people will be joining us as we go along. So if you see me being a little bit distracted, it's because I'm letting people in. I will let people drift in for another minute or so before I introduce Stuart Frost, just so that it's not still quite busy with people joining. So if you want to take the opportunity to just get a drink or anything else while we wait for the admissions to finish, that would be great. If anybody wants to pose a question as we go along, feel free to put something in the chat. If you feel that you'll forget it, I mean, you can either write it down, but you can put it in the chat, and we can come back to that after the talk. And at that time, I'll ask you if you would like to ask the question yourself. This is a Zoom meeting rather than a seminar or webinar, so you can participate and interact. Okay, so that we finish up in time and let Stuart get on with his day as well, I will just quickly introduce the topic of this talk. As you will well know, I think all of you, it is LGBT plus or LGBTQIA plus History Month, and we are well aware of this in the Department of Archaeology at Durham, as well as many other people being well aware of this, and we wanted to mark that the month with a talk by somebody either on the topic of LGBT plus histories or about practice, about their career. So we're very, very lucky to have Stuart Frost joining us this month in 2022 in order to discuss the interpretation of objects and collections and histories in the British Museum, histories through objects. If you could all mute yourself, apart from us, obviously, that would be useful. So Stuart has been working at the British Museum for 10 years. He says it seems like it's gone by in a flash, I think. Would that be correct in saying so?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can't believe it's 10 years. And his role is primarily in helping to develop special exhibitions, but his job title is the head of interpretations and volunteers, or interpretation and volunteers. He can tell you more about his job than I can, so I will pass over to him to do that. Those of you who are thinking about careers in heritage, in museums and interpretation, you may have questions on that front for him following his talk. As I say, keep a note of your questions and we'll come back to them after the talk. And I'm going to pass over to Stuart Frost now. Thank you ever so much for joining us to give this talk.
It's my pleasure. Okay, so I'm going to try and talk for about 30 minutes and then hopefully have plenty of time for questions. And what I'm going to be talking about today really is ongoing project at the museum to look at how we interpret LGBTQ histories across the museum site and how we might do that in the future. So the museum's working towards a complete redisplay of its collection in the permanent galleries. That's a really long-term project. So it probably take something like 20 years. But we're obviously working towards that bigger redisplay of the collection and how we address LGBTQ histories and other histories that are underrepresented in the older galleries is a really big question. Okay, so I'm just going to kick off, and I just start with an image of the British Museum looking into the Great Court, and this is the view that I guess most people will see when they arrive at the museum, going through the main entrance into the building, into the Great Court. And then it's in the Great Court that people make decisions about where they're going to go and what they're going to look at in the museum. Obviously, it's a vast museum, global in scope. The collection ranges from deep history to the present day. And it's a museum with a lot of history. So it's founded in 1753, opens to the public in 1759. And there are obviously some histories which the museum has told more effectively and more openly and more honestly than others. And LGBTQ histories is one of those histories that's been historically underrepresented in the museum's collections and displays and interpretation. What I'm starting with here is an image of cupboard 55. Cupboard 55 is what's left. Cupboard 55 doesn't look like this anymore, sadly. It's full of medieval things, and I love medieval things, but Cupboard 55, what was until the early 2000s, what was left of the Museum Secretum, or the secret museum. So we know at the British Museum from at least as early as the 1830s, there was a restricted collection where material that was too challenging, too sexually explicit, too phallic was segregated from the rest of the collection. So when objects came to the museum that were too challenging for display, they weren't accessioned or catalogued. They went to a larger restricted collection. Access was carefully restricted, and the Museum Secretum grew over time. So in 1865, there was a large collection of phallic objects acquired from someone called George Witt, and at that point, the secret museum was formalized. And basically, it existed until the 1950s, or it proactively operated until the 1950s. Then it stopped functioning, and gradually objects that were in the secretum were dispersed and sent back, or not sent back. They were sent out to curatorial departments and registered and became part of the collection. And a large proportion of the objects went out on display. And in the early 2000s, there was still a small part of the Museum Secretum left. It was being kept as a sort of a time capsule of Victorian attitudes to collecting, but it no longer exists. And so I think it's an example of how the museum has in the past suppressed certain aspects of culture or history and not addressed them meaningfully in the displays. And so some of the objects that are on display today and that are part of the LGBTQ trail that I'm going to talk about were once in the secret museum collection. So I think given that the museums have this history of suppressing certain histories, it's really important that they play a proactive role in undoing some of that work. And in terms of the museum beginning to meaningfully engage with LGBTQ histories, I'd say it really started to do that around 2000. And that from that point onwards, gradually more and more work started to go on at the museum. And one of the catalysts for change in driving that was the acquisition of this Roman silver cup, which you can see on screen now. So this cup is known as the Warren Cup because it was owned previously by someone called Edward Perry Warren, who's a wealthy Bostonian, a collector of classical antiquities. He sets up home in Lewes in Sussex and assembles a collection, a lot of which ends up in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And Warren acquires, he's interested in erotic material and sort of homoerotic material. And he acquires the Warren Cup. It's a Roman silver cup. It belongs to the world of elite dining. It's said to have been found in Batir, near Jerusalem. And there obviously are plenty of other silver cups that survive from the Roman world, but this one is sort of unique in its subject matter. Although this type of subject matter, pairs of male lovers, are depicted on other Roman drinking vessels. So the museum acquired this cup in 1999. At that point, it was the most expensive object I think the museum had ever purchased. And in a lot of ways, the cup exemplifies changing attitudes to LGBTQ histories throughout the 20th century. So as I say, it belonged to Warren. When Warren dies in 1928, there's an attempt to sell the cup, to find buyers for it, but it proves really difficult object to sell. In the 1950s, it is offered to the British Museum. The British Museum at that point declines the opportunity to acquire it. The cup is sent to the United States, but it's turned in the 50s, but it's turned back at customs on the grounds of obscenity. Fortunately, the museum has a chance to acquire it, to purchase it again, which it does in 1999, and it's been on display ever since. So you can see on the cup two pairs of male lovers. You can see that they're in sort of cultured, Hellenized settings, musical instrument to the left, to the scene of the left. There's lots of furnishings, sort of well-appointed interiors. On the sides that you can see to the left, there's a young boy peering in through the door. And then on the right-hand side, there's another pair of male lovers, again, slightly younger, but in each pair, there's a slightly older active lover, and then a slightly younger passive partner. And I suppose that the cup is perhaps best interpreted as a Roman imagining of what happened in the ancient Greek world that they admired so much. Anyway, the Warren Cup was acquired. It went on to display, and then I think it attracted a lot of interest and publicity, and the museum started to get requests about developing trails and content related to LGBTQ history. So in 2006, one of my colleagues, Professor Richard Parkinson, developed a trail, an LGBTQ history trail, looking at objects across the museum that were on display. And that trail's gone through several different iterations and versions over the years. And Richard's work's been really key and a lot of what we've done at the museum recently and what we're continuing to do. In 2013, Richard published this book, A Little Gay History, Desire, Diversity Across the World. And it's been a really invaluable book in helping us drive what we're doing at the museum. Basically, the book looks at 40 objects from across the museum collection. It's trying to be global in scope, and it's going from deep history to the present day. And it's got a brilliant essay at the beginning of the book, which I would recommend if you want to find out a little bit more. When this book came out, Richard and I had sort of various conversations about what we could do to build on that book and to keep things moving forward at the museum. And so we developed an idea to develop an exhibition and display, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But just, I'll show a few examples of objects that sort of Richard highlighted in the book, just to give you a sense, a feel for it. So the first object that he highlighted is this sculpture, which is 11,000 years old, and it's called Ein Sacri lovers. So it's from the Middle East, and it depicts a pair of people engaged in sex. And basically, the way Richard used this in the book was as a provocation to encourage people to think. So I think the assumption that a lot of people would make when they're looking at this pair of lovers is that they must be heterosexual. But actually, when you look at the object itself, and you look at it from all sides and turn it around in your hands, it's quite small. It is sort of a handheld size sculpture. Actually, when you look closely at it, it's really impossible to say whether they are heterosexual, whether it's a man and a woman, whether it's two men, whether it's two women. So I just use it to pose the question, like why do we assume, we're looking back on the past, that things must be heterosexual, and sort of that becomes the inspiration for looking at other objects in the collection. Obviously, in terms of looking at LGBTQ histories through the BM collection, we have to be honest and say that there are limitations to the collection, and that it's easier to find LGBTQ histories in some parts of the collection. It's more difficult in others. In terms of LGBTQ representation, it isn't necessarily even either. And there are obviously the various reasons for that. In terms of the classical world, and the male experience in the classical world is very heavily represented in our collection. This is an Athenian amphora made about 540 BC, and as you can see, it's decorated with scenes of male courtship. So you have bearded men courting younger partners, presenting them with gifts. Some of the men are clearly aroused, and some of the couples are engaged in sex. And so this is something that belongs to the world of the symposium, and there are lots of representations that reflect male desire. If you look very closely at the bottom of this particular object, you can see there's a number, and it has 1865. This was part of the Whip collection. So this is an object that when it came to the museum, it went into the Museum Secretum, and this is something that we put on display in 2017 as part of the trail. Trans experience is not so well represented in the collection. In the book, Richard includes these prints of the Chevalier Dion. The Chevalier Dion is 18th century figure who attracts a lot of interest in the media at the time, and becomes the sort of celebrity figure. Hence, there are lots of images of them in our collection. Basically, the Chevalier Dion, for the part of their life, live and dress as a man. They've a soldier. They work as a spy for the French king. They work as a diplomat for the French government. They move to London, and then round about 1777, the Chevalier Dion starts to dress as a woman, and then they live as a woman for the rest of their life. And there's a lot of media fascination, if you like, about the Chevalier at the time. And the image on the left dates to 1777, when there is this really intense speculation in the British media about whether the Chevalier is a man or a woman. So this isn't really a portrait as such. It's more of a caricature, but capturing that sort of intense debate. The image on the right is actually about 10 years later, so 1787, and it's more of a true portrait of the Chevalier as they were at that point in their life. We have lots of badges in the museum collection. So there are about 500 badges that relate to LGBTQ campaigns from the 1970s to the present day. And although people primarily think of the British Museum, maybe they primarily associate it with ancient civilizations and historic material, the museum does now proactively collect contemporary work, and including contemporary work by LGBTQ artists. This particular print is a part of a series called Rainbow Aphorisms, and it's produced by an Australian artist and activist, David McDermid. And it's a few examples of objects that Richard highlighted in his book. He also highlighted these prints by David Hockney, which were we had two exhibitions in 2017 to mark the 50th anniversary of the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in England and Wales. One was this display of David Hockney etchings and drawings, which I curated. And then we also had a Desire of Identity exhibition, which I'm going to come on to next. But these etchings were particularly important, I think, in the context of 2017, because David Hockney made these etchings worked on them in the early 1960s. They were issued in 1966 at a time when homosexuality was still illegal, but Hockney was living as an openly gay man, and he's spoken about these prints as a way of defending his way of life and sort of using them to advocate for change in a way. So on the left, you have a portrait of the Greek poet Constantine Cavafi, who spent most of his life living in Alexandria in Egypt. And Hockney based this portrait on a photograph. And he basically produced etchings to illustrate 14 poems from Cavafi's body of work, particularly the poems that Cavafi wrote about male love and desire. And for each poem that Hockney selected, he paired it with an etching. And you can see one of those etchings on the right. But these are not literal illustrations of Cavafi's poetry. Hockney sort of drawing on his own experiences and producing etchings using sort of drawings of friends and so on. And so they're more responding to the mood of Cavafi's poetry, and they were paired with the poems afterwards. Anyway, so these etchings probably, it would have been difficult for them to be published any year earlier than they were, and they spoke so strongly to the 1967 anniversary that we thought it was important to display those. And they are some of them are currently on display in our Islamic World gallery, and they're used as part of our volunteer-led LGBTQ tours. So the other exhibition that we developed, inspired by Richard's book, was Desire of Identity, Exploring LGBTQ Histories. And you can see here in the middle, in this freestanding case, the Ein Sacri lovers sort of being presented as like a provocation. And on the right-hand side, you can see various works in the collection that are recent acquisitions, contemporary collecting. And this exhibition was quite small, but it was an important catalyst for change. And we did get a lot of really positive feedback about it, and we did a lot of evaluation around it as well. It was in quite a small exhibition space, but I personally would have liked it to be in a much bigger space, but it was the space that the museum allocated us for the display when we proposed it. And what I want to say about this exhibition really is it was very collaborative, and it was a different way of working for us as a museum. So the display itself was proposed, the Hockney exhibition and this exhibition was proposed by myself and Laura Phillips, who's head of community partnerships. But really, it was we wanted it to be a collaborative way of working. And so when we developed this show, we did a call out to staff across the museum. So we put something up on the intranet saying, we're going to be developing some LGBTQ displays to mark the 50th anniversary of decriminalisation. If you'd like to get involved, please come along to some workshops and help us choose the objects and pick the themes. So really, this display was developed by numerous people and lots of different curators across the museum as well. And the staff that were involved in this group were not all curatorial staff. So there were people from visitor services, there were people who deal with photo imaging and licensing of images, people from the shop. And it was a different way of working. And we also had a second group of advisors, people from our community partners, different organizations that we've worked with for a number of years, to help shape the exhibition. And the title for this show, Desire of Identity, Exploring LGBTQ Histories, came from one of our community partners who proposed it, and the rest of the group agreed that that was the best title for it. And yeah, we had lots and lots of people involved in reading text and commenting and helping shape it. So a key part of this exhibition was to try and create a dispersed exhibition, something that would impact on as many people visiting the museum as possible. So from the beginning, we wanted to have a trail or interventions across the museum that highlighted objects that would impact on people who were just walking past, who might see something, get drawn to it, and then read it. So everything that's in this exhibition space was something that hadn't been on display before. So we were trying to highlight things that were in the collection but hadn't necessarily been on display. And then in the permanent gallery, try to use a trail to link out, to show objects in the permanent galleries that had been on display, in some cases for quite a long time, but maybe not interpreted in a way that highlighted the LGBTQ dimension. So we developed a trail. We highlighted 15 objects across the permanent galleries. There were lots of practical constraints about trying to create a trail where people could find the objects relatively easily, where people could fairly comfortably walk around it in about an hour. Because if we wanted people to be able to do the exhibition and the trail in a single visit. So we picked 15 objects. There were, of course, far more objects that we could have picked, but we felt we had to make decisions. And then we developed a graphic identity to try and help those objects stand out in the museum galleries. And then basically, we tried to highlight the objects with temporary interpretation. And you can see here that there's more text, and more text is not necessarily more effective in museum interpretation, but sometimes it is, and sometimes it does work. And I think this is one of the cases where it did. You can see we left the existing interpretation in place. So there's the standard object label, which you can see on the grey case. But then we had a slightly longer text to talk about the object and explaining its LGBTQ connection. And then underneath, there was a second text which looked at attitudes more broadly in that particular culture. So in this case, looking at ancient Rome's attitude to same-sex love and desire and gender diversity. So 15 of those objects across the museum, some objects from Africa, some objects from the Pacific, some from Japan and Asia. I'm showing quite a lot of classical objects here, but that's just a reflection of the images that I've got to hand, really. So this is an example of the trail in the Japan gallery. Our Japan collection is one of those actually, which is very rich in LGBTQ histories. So again, it's a part of the collection where we could have, there's a lot to display and explore. But in this particular context, we decided to focus on a category of material called Shunga. Shunga is produced in large quantities between 1600 and 1900 roughly in Japan, and it's art that celebrates sex basically. And what's unusual about it is that it's produced by a lot of the greatest artists of the time. So people like Hokusai and Utamaro produced a lot of Shunga, but because it's sexually explicit, it's often been suppressed or under-researched and understudied. And actually, in 1865, Shunga did come into the museum collection, and it went into the secret museum. And it celebrates sex of heterosexual and same sex. So here we put 3 prints on display. They had to be temporary because they're light sensitive. And one looked at a pair of male lovers, and this lady's taking a picture of a book at the bottom of the case, which depicts female lovers. And anyway, Shunga is a sort of a fascinating category of material, and we got a lot of positive responses to displaying it. And I think a lot of visitors really enjoyed or found it interesting to read the old label alongside the new label, because I think as you can see from that comment there, it made people aware of how much agency the museum has in what it chooses to tell and what it chooses to leave out sometimes. I was going to include a close-up of the Shunger Book, but it's quite explicit, so I lost my confidence before the talk, and I've gone for a more neutral image. This is a beautiful scroll painting. So a lot of Shunga is mass-produced printed books or sheets about the price of a double helping of noodles. This is really deluxe painting, and it's painted on gold leaf background. It's from the early 1600s, and it depicts a pair of male lovers with a female attendant who's sort of arranging the quilt over them. So I won't talk too much about the evaluation of the exhibition. I can say more about it if people are interested. But generally speaking, although this exhibition itself was quite small, we did get a lot of really positive feedback about it, particularly about the trail. And overall, the feedback was more positive than usual. And we did a lot of social media around it. Social media at the time, again, was overwhelmingly supportive and positive. And we also did qualitative evaluation. So we ran several focus groups with different people to find out what they thought of the trail. We did various interviews, short interviews with people in the galleries to find out what they thought. And all of that insight is basically informing the strategies that we're developing and building on now. Yeah, and generally speaking, people wanted more. And there's obviously is a lot more that we could have highlighted as part of the trail. So now, sort of moving towards the ongoing work, we wanted to use as I said, this project to be a catalyst to develop new ideas, to test different ways of doing things, and we wanted there to be a legacy to the project. So unfortunately, the exhibition itself was on from May to October 2017. When the exhibition came to an end, the trail interpretation had to come down. And so we wanted to make sure that there was a meaningful legacy to that, and it just didn't all disappear. So one of the things we did was basically update all of the labels in the galleries to make sure that they acknowledged the LGBTQ connection and directed people to a place where they could find out more. We wanted to create a permanent trail that people could follow around the museum. So we recorded an audio tour for each of the objects that had been highlighted. And so now if you go to the museum, there is an audio trail and a leaflet, so you can do a self-guided visit around the museum and explore some of the most significant or high-profile famous objects in the collection that have LGBTQ connection. We used all of the research that we've done to start to develop volunteer-led tours. So part of my role at the museum is head of volunteers. We have 500 volunteers at the museum. We, on an average day, sort of before the pandemic, we'd run 15 different gallery talks every day. Volunteers do an amazing job of helping people make sense of the collection. And we thought that creating LGBTQ tours would be a really good way of continuing the work and providing a focus for ongoing research and work. So we recruited a team of volunteers. We did a call out to some of our existing volunteers, people who we knew would be interested and had already got in touch and said they'd like to be involved in developing a new tour, and also people externally. So we did a call out via blogs and social media, and people got in touch. And those tours have been going really well. I'll say a bit more about those towards the end of the talk. We were also fortunate to be in a position to develop a touring exhibition based on putting together the David Hockney show and the exhibition Desire of Identity. We could put those together and create a version that toured to different venues in England. So between 2018 and 2019, we developed an exhibition that went to 5 different venues. So just very quickly, this is the audio tour. This is one page from the leaflet. Some of the evaluations showed that our initial leaflet wasn't very good, basically. It wasn't very effective. So we redesigned it to create something that was easier for people to follow. So this leaflet helps people find the objects in the gallery, and then they can listen to a much longer commentary about the object on their own device. Yeah, I won't say too much about this other than the museum does do a lot of work around the country lending objects, and the Desire of Identity exhibition, the tour fitted into this bigger piece of work. And the exhibition, the touring version of the exhibition, I think was a great thing to be involved in. It generated a lot of press. I think there were over 200 newspaper articles over the course of the 2-year run of the exhibition. So I think it did a lot of, it had a lot of impact, which was really great. And each venue that it went to, it was curated by people at that particular institution, and they adapted things and did things slightly differently. So this is the version of the exhibition at the Ashmolean in Oxford, where it was paired with an exhibition about Antinous, the lover of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. Yeah, and I won't say, I can't really go into too much detail about it, but at each venue, they added objects from their own collection. And so the Ashmolean, there's a section that related to the film Morris, based on a novel written by E.M. Forster. And they did all sorts of programming where James Ivory, who was involved in making the film, came over and did various talks about the film and the impact that it had. And one of the scenes from that film was set in the British Museum. You can see some photographs in the case. But yeah, each museum did the exhibition differently, and at each exhibition, each venue, the context changed the impact of the show slightly, the way that situating it in different types of buildings. So the National Justice Museum was a courthouse. It drew out different resonances, I think. So these are just photographs of the exhibition at Nottingham, and at Nottingham they did a great piece of work where they brought in a creative writer, and they ran workshops with LGBTQ community from the surrounding area from the city, and they published a volume of stories inspired by the exhibition afterwards. At the Bolton Museum, was probably the exhibition was at its biggest and its brightest and boldest, and I really loved what the team at Bolton did with the exhibition. You can see some David Hockney drawings here. So this part of the show is all British Museum objects, and then over here, parts of the show at Bolton were curated by staff at the museum and other community partners and so on. And this is a display of work by a local author, Matt Kane, who's written a novel about his experiences as a gay man growing up in Bolton. This is the Millennium Library in Norwich, and here they worked with young LGBTQ community curators to add objects to the exhibition that told local histories, sort of queer histories in Norwich. And as part of this, they set up collecting sessions. So they were proactively collecting material to add to their collection to strengthen local histories and local stories. Yeah, so there's the exhibition, and then we've tried to create ongoing work to keep the momentum going forward. So we have a section of the website, a portal into the collection database, where we're adding subjects to highlight different stories and connections, and gradually over time keep adding more and more content to this part of the website, so that there are subjects about the ladies of Llangollen, the Chevalier Dion, our campaign badges, and so on. And we're working on adding more to that at the moment. And then finally, there's the LGBT Tutors, which I mentioned earlier. They started running in 2019 and have been going incredibly well. But when we first advertised them, the run of tours booked out immediately. So the demand is very high, and we're recruiting more guides so that we can keep up with demand. But the way that this program's been running is a little bit different to our other volunteer programs, because we've tried to run it in a way where the volunteers are driving the tour and how it shapes and how it goes forward. So we've been working with different community partners to research different parts of the collection, to add new objects to this bigger spreadsheet that the volunteers can choose from when they're creating the tours. But basically, it's the volunteers who decide which objects go on the tour. So people propose new objects. Sometimes they do a bit of research. They suggest a new object for the tour. It's then shared with the wider group, as well as the specialist curator. And it's the group's decision about whether the object should be part of the tour or whether it shouldn't be. And we're adding new things all of the time. This is something that's on display in the Money Gallery. It's basically a banknote that was produced for a club night in London, run by Ducky, and it's sort of a play on the expression, the once common expression of as queer as a 9-bob note. Well, this is actually made a 9-bob note with a depiction of Ronnie Cray on it, and this was donated to the museum by one of the curators. It's now on display in the Money Gallery, and it's one of the objects that the volunteers use when they're doing their tours of the museum, which I hope you'll get a chance to go on at some point. So I hope that's a summary of work that's going on at the museum at the moment. I think I've been talking for a little bit longer than I anticipated, so I'll stop. And then, yeah, if people have questions, I'd be delighted to answer them.
Thanks ever so much, Stuart. That's fantastic. I'm really grateful for such an interesting talk. And I have a question, probably a rather pedantic question, but I will save that and I will open the discussion up to the floor. I'm sure there are people who want to ask questions about how you went about organizing these kinds of exhibitions, ideas, especially community uh, collaboration, things like that. So, audience, over to you. Anthony has a question. You can
Oh,
unmute.
yeah. Hello. Yeah, no, thank you very, very much for that, Stuart. That's been a really fascinating talk to what you've been doing. There's a lot of things there I wasn't actually aware of, so it's really interesting to see what's been going on. My question really, I suppose, was about public reaction. Obviously, there's a real range of things in the tour. So have you been doing any specific feedback and evaluations of how visitors have actually been responding? Because obviously the BM's visitor profile is a really diverse international audience. So just wondering how that had been received.
Yeah, so we get feedback through different channels. I mean, I think generally speaking, with the volunteer-led LGBTQ tours, the feedback's universally positive, because obviously people that are going on an LGBTQ tour have made a conscious decision, they're interested. The feedback we get from those from members of the public is really positive. I mean, in terms of things like the trail, when we had the 2017 version of the trail and the current version, I've had occasional complaints from people. So one of the objects that we highlight in the medieval gallery is St. Sebastian, for example. And so I've had some complaints from American Christians who felt it's not appropriate to highlight St. Sebastian as part of an LGBTQ trail. We've had people ask about, in response to social media and other things on the website, write in and ask about what the evidence is for certain interpretations and so on. But we've obviously been through a really robust process of researching, checking. The specialist curator's always been involved in signing content off. So you can usually send people a pretty comprehensive reading list and say, like, if people can find something that's factually inaccurate, then we're happy to look at it. But if it's something that they don't like it, then yeah.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Anthony, for your question. Any other questions from the audience? You're welcome to put them in the chat. While we wait, Stuart, I have a question about the Warren Cup. Now, Luca Giuliani, as you all know, has argued that that cup is a fake. Has that been addressed in this particular exhibition? Because it would, of course, have an impact on reading implications for sexuality in the Roman world.
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, I think the museum's position on it is fairly robustly that it isn't a fake. It's not something that members of the public have ever asked about. So I think it obviously in academic circles, obviously there's been debate and discussion about it. But in the day-to-day work of interpreting objects for the public, it's not something that we've addressed, although we felt that we've had to address. So I mean, the cup itself in the museum and the permanent galleries is displayed with a small cameo fragment, which has a part of a scene of two male lovers, and then there's a piece of Aretine ware which has similar scene or fragment of a similar scene. So in that sense, it's clear that this subject matter it exists on Roman tablewares of different types, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I've seen it, and I mean, I think that there's enough there to show. I mean, you'd have to prove that the glass. Sorry, is it cameo glass or is it? I think it's glass, isn't it? And the pottery were also fake.
Yeah, it's a
In order
cameo
to
fragment.
extend that reading of the
Yeah,
kind of to
yeah,
squash the homosexuality.
yeah. It is a cameo glass fragment, and again, it was something that came into the museum in the 19th century, and it wasn't. That's another one of the objects that was in the secret museum.
Yeah. Okay, I have something from Davina Thompson in the chat, who asks whether you would ever bring the objects together again in a specific exhibition. It sounds that the trail has been successful, which is great, but would you bring them together again in exhibition? I suppose the question there is, have you kind of done that, or is there scope for a further exhibition?
I think there's definitely scope for further exhibitions, and that's something that I'd obviously would love to see. So it would be great to do something on a bigger scale, and to throw the sort of a budget that you get with an admission charging show at it. But I mean, I think with this, the advantage of, I think what we did with the trail and the free show is that it impacts on a really large number of people. So I think, I mean, in total, including the audiences for the touring exhibition, they're around probably about 450,000 visitors. So it had a really a lot of people saw it and encountered it. But yeah, I think the quick answer to that is yes. I think we'd love to do more exhibitions, and we certainly need to do more collections based research. So there's more research going on at the moment. I'm trying to get resourcing and get sponsorship so we can do more research into other parts of the collection, and keep adding more and more objects that to the pool.
Thank you. There's another question here from Susanna. Susanna, do you want to unmute and ask the question? I'm happy to ask it for you if you would like, which you can say in the chat.
Hello.
Hello.
Hiya. So I suppose I was thinking about, because it is such a wide-ranging thematic exhibition across so many departments in the college, how does that work while the exhibition is being developed? And then additionally, once you've sort of established some potential objects, how do you narrow that down into a narrative once you've established all of the context of possible LGBT objects that could be displayed? How does that narrow down?
Quite a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question. So this programming, like the exhibition, the trail, the volunteer-led tours, the web content, I mean, it has involved a really large number of people. Normally, when we work on an exhibition, let's say the Stonehenge show, which is just opened at the museum's major, big admission charging exhibition. They're usually curated by one or two curators who are obviously drawing on lots of other people's work. But for a show like this, yeah, absolutely. That if you're including an object, let's just say from a Pacific culture or a West African object, then obviously there's a lot of specialist knowledge involved in interpreting those objects and talking about them sensitively and appropriately. So it took a lot more work than people might realize, I think, with this exhibition. I think even internally, people might not realize how much work was involved in going to talk to individual curators, redrafting things, checking the content. So yeah, I think probably my estimate is that there'd be at least 40 people, curatorial people, probably involved in checking content and helping write some of it. And then obviously the role of of Laura and myself is to make sure that everything's consistent and that there's a tone of voice that's sort of consistent across everything, even though it's sort of been multi-authored. And then, yeah, picking the objects is just very, like I said briefly during the talk, I think in terms of the trail, there's just very practical things about, you know, because the museum's over 6 floors, there are, you know, over 60 permanent galleries. You have to try and create a route that people can actually follow fairly easily through the museum, and you don't want there to be too big a gap where people are having to walk for 8 minutes before they see something. There's some really amazing objects that are not displayed because a lot of the museum's permanent galleries at the moment are quite old. You know, some things are displayed too low down, so I don't really want to highlight them and ask people to have to bend down to see something. So there's sort of really practical things. In terms of adding the interpretation to the case, sometimes we had steal a sign alongside an object like the Warren Cup, but in other cases we applied the text as a vinyl to the glass to the front of the case. So again, there had to be, when we were looking at the objects, it's like, can we physically fit the interpretation in where the object is without having to do a major redesign of the case, because we didn't have the time to do that for everything. So it was a mixture of practical and sort of philosophical things. We obviously wanted the trail to be as representative of the collection as possible, so we were trying to be global in scope, so to include things from you know, every continent basically, as far as we could. It was quite tricky.
Thanks for that. There's another question from Eloise. Again, would you like to come in yourself, Eloise, or do you want me to address the question for you?
No, it's okay. I can.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks.
I was wondering if there was if you had like a favorite object or like an object that really stood out in terms of like its background and sort of surrounding context.
Good question. So probably my favorite object on the trail is a pair of chocolate cups that belong to the ladies of Llangollen, basically 2 women who grow up in Ireland, form a strong bond and run away together so that they can spend their life together. And they set up home in North Wales in a house which they sort of gradually Gothicize, and they live happily together for 50 years. Again, they become sort of like celebrity type figures, and that people are fascinated by their sort of romantic way of life. And so we have prints of them in the collection later in life, where they're surrounded by sort of their collection of beautiful things. But I love those chocolate cups because they're just quite domestic objects. So you can just imagine, you know, them sitting down of an evening, sharing some chocolate, and yeah, I think a lot of the volunteers really like those as well, because they're just yeah, maybe some more of an ordinary domestic type of object.
That's so sweet. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Stuart and Eloise. Does anybody else have any questions? No, nobody's coming in with further questions. Stuart, thank you ever so much. I think probably in order to end up at the right sort of time, so that people can go on to other meetings if they need to, we should wrap up now. Did you have anything that you wanted to add in the end, about your work in general, or what you're doing at the moment, for instance? I would ask that as a final question, if I may.
I mean, generally speaking, like the most of my work is revolves around the special exhibition. So the special exhibition program is planned about 4 or 5 years in advance. So I'm a little bit like an air traffic controller. And the different exhibitions, some are just about ready to open, others are at early stages of development. So there's a really amazing range of shows coming up at the moment, and that's sort of keeping me pretty occupied with things at the moment. Yeah, but I hope if people are interested and that get an opportunity to come along on one of the volunteer-led tours at the museum, or to listen to the audio tour. It sort of also works remotely. You don't have to be on site to do it. And if anyone's got any suggestions of anything that they think we might have in our collection that would be a great addition to the LGBTQ tours, I'd really welcome any, if people are familiar with any of the objects or types of objects or people. All suggestions would be really, really gratefully received, because there are about 80,000 objects on display in the museum, and in the prints and drawings department, again, there's just huge potential. So if anyone's got any suggestions, they'd be very welcome.
Thank you ever so much. I would just like to express our gratitude to you for delivering this talk, and encourage everybody to look at those resources and to visit the British Museum and to participate in the way that Stuart had asked us. So I guess it just remains to me to say goodbye, and thank you ever so much to everybody who came. Thanks again to Stuart, and we'll hope to see you again for further talks, not only in LGBTQ plus month, but for some of our other special seminars as well at Durham. So thank you ever so much, and I'll bid you adieu.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.